the civilization professor. Usually, every school is probably a little bit different because it depends on the textbook and the professor, but usually the class starts in 3,400 BC, or if you're like me and you reject BC because it's confusing, 5,400 years ago. And then the class usually goes, it depends again on the text and the professor, but it usually goes to 1648 with the end of the 30 Years' War, which didn't end in 1648 and lasted about 50 years, just for the record, just to make things not work. And then Intro to Western Civ 2 usually starts in 1648 and goes to the present, which I've always thought was remarkable because it shows our bias for the contemporary period, because we're going to take 5,000 years of history, 5,400 years ago, to 400 years ago, and we're going to compress that into 16 weeks, and then we're going to do 3.5 centuries in 16 weeks. It seems like an unfair distribution. We're literally giving the recent centuries 17 times the attention that we gave the old centuries. But okay, set that aside for a moment. Odds are good that your professor will start this class with maybe one, maybe two, but probably one lecture on Mesopotamia and Sumer and the beginning of writing. And then maybe the second lecture will briefly cover Egypt. And then from there, your professor is going to probably go on and spend a huge amount of time on the Greeks, an enormous amount of time on the Romans, and then the Middle Ages kick in, maybe a lecture on the Middle Ages. They lasted 1,000 years. Maybe it gets a lecture. And then there'll be a lecture or two at the end of the class because the Italians go, hey, I have an idea. Let's do the Renaissance. And that's a really exciting time period. And then the class ends with the completion of the 30 Years' War, when Protestants and Catholics slaughter each other wholesale in Europe. The 30 Years' War is one of my favorite wars because Spain and Sweden fight each other. You know what I mean? You almost don't need to know anything else about the war. They fought 3 battles in Germany. The Spanish army and the Swedish army met in Germany, and they beat the crap out of each other. For the record, the Swedes, while they were in Germany, plundered it. So did the Spanish, of course. You're in Germany, come on, of course you're going to plunder. And they stole a bunch of stuff from the city of Würzburg, and they took it back to Sweden, and a bunch of that ended up in museums. And the city of Würzburg, a few years ago, sued Sweden to get their stuff back from 1648. And the European Union went, no, sorry, too bad you lost it. I thought, wow. Why, you ask? Well, because if Stockholm had to return to Würzburg its plundered goods, then Berlin and London would have to return to Egypt and Iraq its plundered goods. That would have been a catastrophic event for museums in Europe, right? One of my favorite museums on the planet is the Pergamon Museum. It's in Berlin. If you love anything to do with the Middle East, it is amazing. You have to go to the Pergamon in Berlin. They have a whole Greek temple that the Germans took out of Turkey stone by stone. They have the gates of Babylon that they took out of Iraq stone by stone, and they erected it inside a building specifically constructed to have these 2 marvels inside them. And in a way, I'm grateful because you can go see it, they're intact, they're preserved. In a way, I'm horrified because these weren't German national treasures. I have actually been to the Temple of Pergamon that's in Berlin, in Turkey. I've been to Pergamon. And there's like you know where it is. It's like, wow, so I've been to both. I've seen where it's supposed to be, and I've seen where it is. The reason why I'm bringing up the class is because nested in it is a really interesting admission and then a massive omission. The admission is that Western civilization started on the banks of the Euphrates, the Tigris, and the Nile, and then they're never talked about again. That's it. Cover it for a week, and then in the next 31 weeks, we're going to talk about how amazing European civilization really was. Now, obviously, European civilization is amazing. I mean, I'm, after all, speaking a European language in North America. You don't get here and conquer 2 whole continents with at least not having a really strong propensity to violence. You know what I mean? There has to be something there. It didn't just happen. I'm 0% Native American. 23andMe broke my heart. I was really hoping I'd be, like I could have my little dances with wolves fantasy. Just, no. So, you know, here we are. Shame. So it's not to reject that there doesn't need to be a story about Europe. It's to wonder about the question, wait a minute, you started in Sumer. Now, I wouldn't have started in Sumer for a different reason. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a historian. Historians start in Sumer because 5,400 years ago is when they mostly agree, there's a little bit of disagreement, that that's when writing started. What a historian is, they're different from a political scientist. A historian believes that civilization starts with writing because a historian is a literary critic who does nonfiction. The difference between a historian and an English major is English majors do fiction, historians do nonfiction. So if there isn't something written, there's nothing for historians to talk about. I, on the other hand, don't care about that. The only thing I care about is politics. So I think government starts civilization, not writing. In fact, why did writing happen in the first place? What happened was bureaucrats were trying to figure out how to keep track of how many cows they had, how much wheat they had stored in the granaries, how many swords they had, how many horses they had. And the politician class went to the bureaucrats and said, you need to come up with some mechanism to keep track of all of this. And so the bureaucrats began coming up with symbol sets for numbers and for items. And over time, those symbol sets evolved into writing. In other words, government had to come first. The year is 6,264, according to the ancient Egyptian calendar. At some point, an ancient Egyptian politician said, you know what sucks? That the farmers don't know what day to plant their crop every year. If we made a calendar and kept track of when spring started, that would really make our lives easier. In other words, even the advent of the calendar isn't the start of civilization. There was a government before that. By the way, just for the record, the Egyptian calendar doesn't have leap years in it, so it's off by 0.24 years. It's actually 0.239, I think. So, in other words, you need to do a leap year every 4 years, but every 100 years you need to skip leap year. But every 1,000 years, you need to go ahead and do the leap year you would have normally skipped. So in the year 2000, we were supposed to skip that leap year, but we weren't because it was the 1,000-year point, so that's why we went ahead and did it anyway. Really complicated, but a lot of fun. The ancient Egyptians, because they don't have that, their calendar is so old, they're off by 4 years. In other words, a way to think of it is the first day of spring has rotated through every single day of their calendar 4 times. So it's really the year 6,260, not 64. I'm bringing that up because what that meant then was farmers every 4 years had to actually move the date one day, right? Because the start of spring. And the Egyptians were like, people can keep track of that, let's just move on. This calendar will be too wonky and complicated otherwise. Egypt probably created government about 6,500 years ago. So civilization in Egypt is probably about 6,500 years old. We think that the Sumerians probably started government a couple of centuries later. So the Sumerians beat Egypt to writing, but the Egyptians beat the Sumerians to government, and the two of them were always really close to each other whenever there was a development.